Did you know that the worst nuclear accident in history happened because of a safety test? It wasn't even supposed to be dangerous, but it led to an explosion that released 400 times more radiation than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And this all happened in a quiet Soviet town called Pripyat, back in 1986. Thousands of people lived nearby, completely unaware of the danger brewing just a few kilometers away.
Today, we're going to dive into the story of Chernobyl. From the mistakes that caused the explosion to the heroic efforts to stop further damage and the haunting effects that are still felt today.
It's a tale of human error, bravery, and the lasting power of nature. So, stay with us as we uncover one of the most shocking events in modern history.
The Chernobyl disaster started with a simple safety test. The workers at Reactor 4 were trying to see if the steam turbine could generate enough power to keep the reactor cool during a blackout. It sounds straightforward, right? But the real problem was the reactor itself. It had design flaws that made it very unsafe under certain conditions.
Exactly. The reactor used a type called RBMK, and it had a serious issue with what's called a positive void coefficient. When water boils inside the reactor, it usually helps to control the reaction. But in this reactor, boiling water made the reaction stronger instead. It created a dangerous feedback loop.
And the workers that night didn't fully understand how dangerous the reactor could become. They reduced the reactor's power to a very low level, but this caused a problem called xenon poisoning. That's when a chemical builds up inside the reactor and stops it from producing power.
To fix that, the operators removed almost all of the control rods, the tools that keep the reactor safe by slowing down the reaction. Without enough rods, the reactor became unstable. And here's the worst part. The safety systems were turned off for the test.
And that's when everything went wrong. At 1:23 a.m., they pressed the emergency shutdown button, thinking it would stop the reactor. But the design of the control rods actually caused a power spike instead. Within seconds, the reactor overheated.
The pressure was too much. There was an explosion, and the 1,000-ton lid of the reactor was blown off. The core was exposed, and radiation started pouring out into the air.
It's horrifying to think how many mistakes happened one after another. A flawed design, poorly trained workers, and a rushed safety test. Together, they created a disaster no one could stop.
And it all happened because people didn't take the time to fully understand the risks. What seemed like a small experiment turned into the biggest nuclear accident in history.
When the explosion happened, it wasn't just one loud bang. People living nearby described seeing flames, smoke, and even a strange blue light coming from the reactor. But what's really shocking is that most of the workers and firefighters didn't know how dangerous the situation was.
That's right. The firefighters were called to put out what they thought was just a building fire. They had no idea they were walking into a cloud of deadly radiation. Some of them picked up pieces of graphite, not knowing it had come from the reactor core. It was so radioactive that holding it for a few seconds could cause severe burns.
And the people in Pripyat? They weren't told anything at first. Life went on as normal. Children played outside, people went to work, and no one realized they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation.
The authorities finally ordered an evacuation 36 hours after the explosion. By then, many people were already showing signs of radiation sickness, like nausea, headaches, and a strange metallic taste in their mouths.
The evacuation itself was fast, though. Buses arrived, and residents were told to pack for just a few days away from home. Can you imagine leaving everything behind, thinking you'd be back soon, but never being allowed to return?
It's heartbreaking. And the delay in evacuating Pripyat wasn't the only problem. The Soviet government tried to keep the disaster a secret from the rest of the world. But radiation doesn't stay in one place.
That's true. In Sweden, workers at a nuclear plant detected unusually high radiation levels on their own clothes. At first, they thought there was a leak at their plant, but they quickly realized the radiation was coming from Chernobyl, over 1,000 kilometers away.
That's when the truth started to come out. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands of lives were already changed forever, and the cleanup was only just beginning.
After the explosion, it became clear that stopping the spread of radiation would take an enormous effort. The first step was putting out the fires. Helicopters were sent to drop sand, clay, and lead onto the burning reactor. They hoped this would block the radiation, but it wasn't enough.
No, it wasn't. The reactor core was still exposed, and it was releasing radioactive materials into the air. That's when the Soviet Union brought in the liquidators, thousands of workers, including soldiers, engineers, and firefighters. Their job was to contain the disaster.
Their tasks were incredibly dangerous. Some liquidators had to clear radioactive debris from the roof of the reactor. Robots were used at first, but they kept breaking down because the radiation was so strong. In the end, humans had to do the work, wearing only basic protective suits.
And they couldn't stay on the roof for long. Most workers were only allowed to be up there for 40 to 90 seconds. Can you imagine? In that short time, they shoveled radioactive debris and ran back down. Many of them later suffered from severe health problems.
Another major problem was the water under the reactor. If the molten core had reached that water, it could have caused another massive explosion. 3 volunteers, engineers, and a shift supervisor risked their lives to drain the water. They had to wade through radioactive water in near darkness to open the valves.
Those men were called heroes, and for good reason. Without them, the disaster could have been much worse. But even after the water was drained, the reactor had to be sealed off.
That's where the sarcophagus comes in. This was a massive concrete structure built to cover Reactor 4 and stop more radiation from escaping. Construction workers worked under extreme conditions, using lead-lined equipment to shield themselves.
The sarcophagus wasn't perfect, though. Over time, cracks appeared, and radiation started leaking again. In 2016, a new structure, called the New Safe Confinement, was built over the sarcophagus. It's designed to last for 100 years and allow crews to safely dismantle the reactor.
It's incredible to think about the bravery of the people involved in the cleanup. They were fighting an invisible enemy, often without the right tools or knowledge, yet they still did everything they could to protect others.
Yes, their sacrifice is a reminder of how much people can achieve when faced with a crisis, even one as terrifying as Chernobyl.
After the explosion, the area around Chernobyl became one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Radiation spread through the air, rivers, and soil, contaminating everything in its path. The government quickly created a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, forcing tens of thousands of people to leave their homes.
And it wasn't just people who suffered. The environment took a huge hit. Do you know about the Red Forest? It was a large pine forest near the reactor that turned reddish-brown and died because of the radiation. Even now, the soil there is so toxic that nothing can grow properly.
Wildlife was affected too. In the years after the disaster, scientists noticed that animals in the area were having problems. Many stopped reproducing, and some were born with strange mutations. Birds, for example, had deformed beaks or missing feathers.
But here's the surprising part. Over time, nature has started to come back. Without people living there, animals like wolves, deer, and even wild horses have returned to the area. It's strange to think that a disaster so harmful to humans has created a kind of safe haven for wildlife.
That's true, but the dangers of radiation are still very real. People exposed to the fallout faced serious health risks. Many workers and firefighters got what's called acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. It causes symptoms like severe burns, vomiting, and even organ failure.
And let's not forget about long-term effects. In the years after the accident, cases of thyroid cancer increased, especially in children. That's because radioactive iodine was released into the air and got into the food and milk people consumed.
Some studies predict thousands more cancer cases in the future. But what's just as harmful is the psychological impact. Imagine losing your home, your health, and your way of life. Many survivors suffered from depression, anxiety, and a constant fear of the unknown.
It's heartbreaking. The effects of Chernobyl aren't just physical, they're emotional and mental too. The disaster changed lives forever, and even decades later, the land and its people are still trying to recover.
And while nature might be healing in some ways, the scars left by Chernobyl remind us of the disaster's enormous cost. It's a warning about how much damage we can cause if we're not careful.
The Chernobyl disaster taught the world many lessons, though they came at a terrible cost. One of the biggest changes was in nuclear safety. After the accident, countries around the world reviewed their nuclear power plants to make sure something like this would never happen again.
That's true. For example, the RBMK reactors like the one at Chernobyl were redesigned to be safer. New safety systems were added to prevent another explosion. And now, tests like the one done at Chernobyl can only happen under much stricter rules.
But the lessons weren't just technical. The disaster also showed the importance of clear communication. The Soviet government tried to hide what had happened, delaying evacuations and warnings. That made things worse for everyone, both in Ukraine and in other countries.
Absolutely. Today, there are international agreements that require countries to report nuclear accidents quickly. The goal is to protect people and the environment as much as possible if something goes wrong.
Another important impact was on how people view nuclear power. After Chernobyl, many countries became more cautious. Some stopped building new reactors, and others shut down their existing plants. The disaster created fear that is still felt today.
But it's not just about fear. Chernobyl also showed us the power of human bravery. Think about the liquidators, the firefighters, and the workers who risked their lives to stop the disaster from getting worse. Their courage reminds us of the best in humanity, even in the darkest moments.
And then there's the legacy of the exclusion zone. It's now a strange mix of tragedy and hope. People can't live there safely, but wildlife has returned in ways no one expected. It's a place where nature is trying to heal itself.
That's true, but the area is still a warning. Chernobyl reminds us of what happens when mistakes are made with such dangerous technology. It shows how small errors, combined with poor planning, can lead to disaster.
The Chernobyl story isn't over yet. Cleanup work continues, and scientists are still studying the long-term effects of the disaster. What we've learned so far has already changed the way we think about energy, safety, and responsibility.
And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. We need to respect the power of the technology we create and never stop working to make it safer for everyone.
The story of Chernobyl is one of mistakes, bravery, and lessons that will stay with us forever. It's a reminder of the risks we take with powerful technology and how important it is to use it responsibly.
And it's also a story about people, those who risked everything to protect others, and those whose lives were forever changed. We hope this episode gave you a deeper understanding of what happened and why it still matters today.
If you enjoyed this podcast, let us know. Who else would you like to hear about? What story should we cover next?
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Your support helps us keep bringing you stories like this. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.